is so good to be with you on this Tuesday in the chapel. It's been a while. We're grateful to be here and offer this service of worship for you. I want to say a welcome to our guest preacher this morning, Reverend Jim Strickland, native of Piedmont, Alabama, has a degree from Jacksonville State University and Scarritt College and Iliff School of Theology in Colorado. He's a certified director of Christian education and ordained as a deacon in the United Methodist Church. He served churches in Alabama, Texas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. And he and his wife, Star, have 2 daughters. Jim enjoys gardening, reading, classical music, and vacationing, which is a little limited right now, but he'll be back out there as soon as he can. And I love his favorite quotation by Aletha Gibson. No matter what accomplishment you make, someone helps you. Yeah. In this time, we are reminded how interconnected we all are and how many people are out there helping one another. For our call to worship, get comfortable and hear these words. God of life, your risen Son has gathered us in worship, nourished us with his body and blood, and poured out upon us your Holy Spirit. Grant that we may receive the blessing of your grace, so that we may love you with all our hearts and gladly feed your sheep in the name of Christ. Let's have a moment of silent meditation and prayer. Amen. Hear now our prayer of confession. God of love and justice, we long for peace within and peace without. We long for harmony in our families, for serenity in the midst of struggle and pandemic, and for commitment to each other. We long for the day when our homes and the world will be a dwelling place for your love. Yet we confess that we are often anxious, we do not trust each other, and we harbor violence. We're not willing to take the risks and make the sacrifices that love requires. Look upon us with kindness and grace. Rule in our hearts and show us how to walk in your paths. The mercy of our Savior. Amen. Our scriptures for this day are from Psalm, chapter 31, verses 3 through 5, and then from John 14, 9 through 11. The psalmist writes, "You are indeed my rock and my fortress. For your name's sake, lead me and guide me. Take me out of the net that is hidden for me, for you are my refuge. Into your hands I commit my spirit. You have redeemed me. O Lord, faithful God." And from the Gospel of John, Jesus said to him, Have I been with you all this time, Philip, and you still do not know me? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, 'Show us the Father'? Do you not believe that I am the Father and the Father is in me? The words that I say to you, I do not speak on my own. But the Father who dwells in me does his works. Believe me that I am in the Father and the Father is in me. But if you do not, then believe me because of the works themselves. Blessed be the reading of God's holy word.
Thank you, Donna. Good afternoon. It is good to be here with you today. I thank you for this opportunity. This place brings back many, many memories for me as a student here in the 60s, especially in this chapel when I was often served as liturgist or in the choir, and where I earned a master's degree in Christian education. And then another joy, in the early 1980s, when I was called by the president of this institution to return and to become the director of admissions and placement. And I served in that role until the school closed, and I'm grateful for that opportunity. Another favorite memory of this place that many of you will relate to was one night we got a call on this campus that Henry Nouwen was going to be in Nashville and was going to be speaking in this very chapel. The word spread all over this city like fire that Henry Nouwen was coming to Nashville. He had friends here to visit with. So the time came and many of us from the administration gathered in a special place in this room early to make sure we had a seat. And slowly this chapel became filled, standing room only. And then people filled up Fondren Hall, people filled up the social rooms. All around this campus there were people that couldn't see but who heard Henry Nouwen. And Henry, throughout his entire lecture that night, broke into song and would continually say, "You are God's beloved sons and daughters." A strong affirmation. Now the lectionary's readings for this week talk about stones and solid foundations and the recognition of who Jesus really was to those men that he had gathered about him. Allow me to backtrack just for a few moments to maybe build a foundation for what I'm going to say. I grew up in a small town, as Donna said, in Alabama, a town of about 2,000 people. And I went to a small United Methodist church in a two-point charge. Our pastor served the city church that I was a member of, and then the country church. So it was a very small situation. My dad had an independent hardware store, and I grew up working and selling hardware in my dad's store. But about my junior year in college, Mother and Dad one night after dinner said, "Son, we have some sad news to tell you. That is that we are not financially able to send you to college. We just simply do not have the resources. And if you want to go to college, which we hope you will, you'll have to earn your way and you'll have to work," which I did. And between my junior and my senior year, the church, the pastor of our 2-point charge, called me one day and said, "Jim, can you come by and have tea with my wife and myself? We want to talk with you." So I went by the parsonage, which was right next door to the church, and I had a cup of tea, and Dr. Draper said, "Jim, some of us in this church feel that God may be calling you to serve in the church, and we want to offer you a job to work in our church with our children and young people for 1 year and for 2 summers. Well, I was flabbergasted. I think as I look at my hindsight, which is always 20/20, I had experienced God talking to me several times, but I had always closed that door because I thought I was going to be the good son and inherit the hardware store and continue to sell hardware. Anyway, to make a long story short, during that second summer, which was my final summer at home, God called me into the ministry. It was on a Sunday morning, during a worship service. And I went down from the choir, down to the altar, and I knelt and I told the pastor that I was being called into the ministry of Christian education. And he leaned over as the congregation was singing a hymn, and he said, "Jim, that's nice, but God only calls people to preach." And I looked up and I said, "I know what I heard." Like most people in North Alabama, I did take a trek over to Candler School of Theology to talk to them about enrolling in the graduate program. Fortunately, the man that I spoke with that day said to me, "Jim, if you quote me on campus, I could lose my job. But I'm telling you, do not come to Candler. You need to go to Scarritt College in Nashville, Tennessee, and earn your degree in Christian education." I hugged his neck. I hugged his neck with joy, and I came to Scarritt. I was admitted to attend here, earn my degree, and was launched out into the world in 1967. And 45 years later, I retired as a certified director of Christian education, serving in, as Donna said, many states in the ministry of our church. I am God's beloved son, like all of you are God's beloved children. While I was here, contemplative prayer meant a lot to me. It helped me find who I was. There was a nun on this campus who was also the campus minister at Vanderbilt Divinity School. Her name was Kathleen Flood. Kathleen Flood was a model to me, a role model to me about how prayer should be. And one night, you'll enjoy this, one night after a prayer group that I was a part of, she said to me, "Jim, can you stay after? I want to talk with you." And she said, "Have you ever considered going to a monastery?" And I said, "Kathleen, I'm married, I have 2 daughters. And she said, no, I mean, you can go as a participant and be there. And there's one not too far from here in Trappist, Kentucky, called Gethsemane." So I got all excited. I called and they had a room ready for me. And I drove up to Kentucky thinking, what am I in for? As I arrived on the campus, went into the main door, the father who was sitting there, I said, "Good evening, I'm Jim Strickland from Nashville." And he quietly raised his hand and pointed to a sign that said, "Silence spoken here." I had been back to that monastery 7 times to enjoy solitude, to enjoy prayer, and to feel God continuing to enrich my life. And for that, I am very grateful. God for me is foundational. God is trustworthy, and God has always been present and is always present to listen, to speak, and to guide us if we will only allow that to come. Now let me return to our lectionary readings. The first thing we read was about Stephen, a man who was so convinced of who he was and who God was in his life, and he was stoned for that belief. His witness was so strong. In Psalms, as Donna was reading to us, we see the affirmation of God's blessings to us daily, a true celebration of God's movement in our life every day. And in the wonderful Gospel of John, we read about the experience of the disciples not fully being aware of who Jesus was in their midst. As I was reading my devotion yesterday from Disciplines, which the Upper Room puts out annually, a statement caught my eye that really troubled me. It said, perhaps the greatest threat to the Christian faith today is apathy. Living today in the midst of this pandemic that's all over the world, that statement really jarred me because I see us all needing to depend on one another to get through this. I asked myself the question, as I think about the scriptures I read from the lectionary, where do we find ourselves in these holy scriptures? I think first of all, we find ourselves needing to listen to God. When I was serving in Houston, Texas at a very large Methodist church, a colleague there on the staff referred to our listening to God as listening with the third ear, listening with your heart, listening with your soul. And when you listen to God with that third ear, you will hear God ever so close and ever so near. What else do we find from these scriptures? We find that God is trustworthy. God will show us the way and will guide us in the ministries for all humankind wherever they are. And in Psalms and in John's Gospel, I find the wonderful story about the disciples wondering who Jesus really was, who was God in their midst. Several years ago, I was asked to speak to a leadership development conference, and I remembered having gone to Walt Disney World in Orlando, Florida, to one of their parks called Epcot, which is the experimental prototype community of tomorrow. And as you go into the American Pavilion, there are sayings all around the wall that Walt Disney thought were worthy of that particular location. And one of those attracted me instantly, and it's the quote that Donna shared with you earlier, that no matter what you accomplish or what accomplishments you make, somebody helps you. Made by an African-American woman, Aletha Gibson. She was the first tennis player to win a national championship. What a wonderful statement about who God is in our lives. For no matter what we do, God is there from the beginning and will be with us all the way through life to share with us who we are and who He's calling us to be. And we are invited and given the opportunity every day to celebrate God's goodness in our life. Christ being with us and guiding us and listening to us if we only trust and follow. Now I'm going to close my comments returning to this lovely campus of the Scarritt Bennett Center. During my second year in my graduate program, Carrie Lou Goddard was a major professor here at Scarritt. And one of the requirements that I needed to fulfill my degree was to work in the Children's Center. We had a building across the campus that was like a kindergarten for children in this area. And it was well known, it was well established, it had a wonderful ministry for these younger children. And I was to spend a year there as a teacher and an administrator, learning how to do that in the local church. Well, we began with, and I must digress just a moment. I thought, I don't need to do that. I'm going to be working with young people and adults. But then I realized that Carrie Lou Goddard had her wisdom that I needed to learn to be a children's person as well. So my year began in the fall. We got through the fall and Thanksgiving and Christmas, and we moved into the spring. And about that time, the Upper Room Chapel, which is directly across the street, built a beautiful garden called the Agape Garden. And they filled it with lovely flowers and blooming trees. There was a fountain in the middle with water trickling down and symbols all around. And in the far corner, they commissioned an artist to create a sculpture of Jesus and the woman at the well. Perhaps many of you have seen that in the corner. It's a very stark representation of who Jesus may be. But the woman is there with her picture, and she and Jesus are talking. So on this particular spring day, we were taking a field trip with our children from the Children's Center. And I was leading the group. We were crossing the street, and we were looking at the pretty flowers and talking about what we were seeing in spring and God's evidence of life everywhere. And we walked around the entire circle there in the garden. And then we stopped where the woman in the well and Jesus, the statue, was. And we stopped and we looked at it, and I tried to interpret to these children what that was, and that this was this artist's interpretation of Jesus speaking to the woman at the well. There were a few questions, but mostly just silence. And so we gathered the children, walked them back across the street. And as we were crossing the street, right in front of where the president's home was, a little girl named Rebecca came up and tugged at my hand, and she says, "Mr. Jim, who was that man up there talking to that lady?" And I said, "You mean the sculptor?" "Yes." I said, "Oh, that's Jesus." And without a doubt, a moment's pause, she said, "That's not the Jesus I know. That's not the Jesus I know." Jesus, for this child, was loving and caring and was her master. And if you remember the statue in the upper room, it's a rather stark representation of who Jesus is. That was that artist's interpretation. But that child's comment has stayed with me all these years. And I ask all of you, as I ask myself, who is the Jesus you know? As you think about the lectionary readings that we read today, we saw Stephen giving a witness for who God was in his life. In Psalms, we read about David saying that God is my strong foundation. And in the Gospel of John, we find the disciples asking Jesus who he really was. I close by asking myself and all of you, are we listening to God every day with the third ear? Are we celebrating the blessings that God gives us every day and affirming how life is good for us? Are we using the gifts and graces that God has given us to serve humankind? And are we aware of Jesus in our life every day? Who is the Jesus you know? Thanks be to God. Amen.
Thank you, Jim. The words on your screen will be the hymn as a response to the message. So saying loud and boldly, as John Wesley says, "How firm a foundation stand as 1 and 2." before us in the life of self-giving. God, it is who leads us on the way